Hey guys, Mikoshi here. Today we'll be discussing an entry-level mapping Omniscience Tornado Shot. I'm going to teach you how to make the build work and how it functions. Before we get into this video, I decided to not put a price point in this one, as in the 10 Divine budget build, it had made a bit of problems because the free market in Path of Exile and a lot of players were following the guide, which meant that a lot of items decided to go up in value. Now, if you wanted to know around how much it would cost to get here, it would probably cost you between 50 to 60, 65 divines. This build is going to be made for mapping purposes. I made this build as an extreme mapper, which is not the best in the single target area. Compared to normal classic Omniscience Tornado Shot, you will feel a massive drop in terms of single target. However, the mapping is going to be twice as good. We're hitting movement speed above 400%, and we are still hitting the 5 million DPS per hour. However, because we are not using Sniper's Mark and we're using a special setup, the single target is going to be a bit lower even for a Tornado Shot build. Now, the next videos in line are going to be the cold conversion build or a crafting guide. So let me know if you guys prefer the crafting guide first or the cold conversion for the Tornado Shots.
I love hunting. This one is captured. I now will take it. We will be best friends, beast, until we slaughter you. Do not worry, little beast. We are friends now. Deserters will be used for target practice. Fall back! Repent! Sinners! There's too many of them!
Oh, but however will you match that last incredible performance?
To safety! Protect the Empire! Try to run!
Into the hills!
Fire!
Back to the dust! We shall not I am sorry, Shield.
Traitors! Fall back!
Right formation!
So for today's video, we're going to go into a brief explanation of the build overview, the gems, and the tree. So which type of Tornado Shot are we going to play? We're going to play the triple elemental trinity setup with a rage mana forge setup. Crystallized Omniscience is a unique amulet that drops from the Exarch. It is the strongest item for bull builds as it replaces your attributes with something called Omniscience. For every 15 Omniscience that you have, you gain 1% elemental resistance and 1% elemental penetration per 15 Omni. This is very strong because your attribute stats are now very useful, and they give a defensive and offensive mod at the same time. It's a 2-for-1. We will stack attributes for a huge DPS and huge resistance boost. And to give you an example on how strong penetration is, let's say you attack an enemy that has a 75% elemental resistance and you deal 100 elemental damage. He will only take 25 of that 100 damage because 75% is mitigated by his resistance. Now, if you had 25% penetration, his resistance would be lowered to 50, which means he wouldn't take 25 damage, he would actually take 50 damage. Effectively, you are doubling your DPS with a mere 25% elemental penetration. Considering that most players have between 1,000 to 1,500 Omniscience, which is between 65 to 100% penetration, you will be doubling, tripling, quadrupling your DPS against certain monsters. Another stat that is sometimes confusing to players is the last stat. attribute requirements can be satisfied by 15 to 25% omniscience. Basically, the higher the number, the better it is. What you need to do is take your highest attribute requirement item, let's say it is 100 dex, and you divide it by the percentage that you see on your omniscience. If the omniscience had 25%, you would divide 100 divided by 25, which would equal 400. You would need 400 omniscience to satisfy the requirement. If it was 20%, you would do 100 divided by 20%, and you would need 500 omniscience to satisfy the equipment. However, because we are kind of omniscience stacking, we will be going in the 1000 plus, which means pretty much all the items that you have will not impose any problems because of the sheer amount of omniscience that you have. Another thing to understand with omniscience is it actually replaces the attribute stats. What do I mean by that is, example, you say a 50 dex on a item, it's going to replace it for a 50 omni. However, if you see 50 dex and strength, it's going to replace it with 50 omni, not 50 to dex and then 50 to strength, which would equal 100, and then replace it. It doesn't work that way. It replaces the whole mod. It is the same logic for all attributes. So example, you see a plus 50 to all attributes, it would not give you 150 omni. It will give you 50 omni. Because single attribute mod are higher in numbers, so dex, strength, and int by themselves are always going to be higher than hybrid, so dex and strength or dex and int, and those are always going to be higher than all attributes. We're going to prioritize single attribute modifiers. As well, what's important to note is increases in attributes will increase all attributes because all of the attributes are actually omniscience. That's why we love to use Black Sun Crest. By replacing our attributes with omniscience, we do lose the inherent benefit of having, well, those attributes. Bow builds are going to have the most dexterity, and dexterity actually gives you 2 accuracy per 1 dexterity. Accuracy is very important because it gives you a chance to hit the enemies, and it rerolls the chance of you critting enemies, so it is very important for DPS. With a basic 32 dex, we will not be able to hit 100% of the time. So it is very important, pretty much the second priority after getting enough omniscience is getting your accuracy capped. We can't talk about omniscience without talking about Tornado Shot. Tornado Shot is the best bow skill in the game. It has a huge clear, a huge single target DPS, and it looks fucking cool. It is very versatile as it has many variants and you can make the build in many different ways. It scales extremely well with additional arrows, it scales extremely well as with how much currency you put in. So it is a build you can make for fairly cheap and that can follow you all the way through the end of your league. We're going to be using the most basic Omniscience Tornado Shot. It's going to be the foundation for the build that you're trying to achieve. You'll be able to farm pretty much all the content in the game. I was easily able to run 60 to 80% delirium. All you have to do is run around the map and kill the stuff. The new ascendancies are a very powerful addition to our build, the Primalist being the strongest and most versatile. However, because we scale a lot of our DPS and clear thanks to arrows, I think that Warden of the Maji is going to be the best option. You'll be able to do a small tech which will grant you +5 arrows for extremely cheap and a lot cheaper than the Primalist charms with +1. The first one being Dying Sun. Obviously, you don't need Dying Sun for simply the Warden of the Maji. You can use Dying Sun with any build. The thing is, Dying Sun gives you +2 projectiles, but it is a flask, which means flask effect will grant you additional projectiles. Because we're using Warden of the Maji, we can use something called the Micro Distillery Belt, which gives you between 20 to 30% increased flask effect, but you cannot use the 5th slot to put a flask. However, we'll be using a tincture in that 5th flask, so we will not have any problems. With that, on top of the Nature's Concoction Ascendancy point, which grants you a 30% increased effect of flask that is adjacent to tinctures when you've hit an enemy, you will basically get, with the Micro Distillery Belt, between 50 to 60% flask effect. A 50% flask effect will grant you an additional projectile when you're using Dying Sun. So Dying Sun will now grant you +3 projectile instead of +2. The fun doesn't stop there. An additional arrow from the Dying Sun might not be enough to actually go from the Primalist to the Warden. However, getting another +2, so a 3 in total, just might. The mod Weapon Attacks fire 2 additional projectile if you've been hit recently on tinctures does not specify if this hit was from an enemy or from yourself. What we're going to be using is something called Forbidden Right. Forbidden Right is a skill which damages yourself to be cast. You're going to use a Mana Forged arrow cast on crit Forbidden Right setup to be able to cast Forbidden Right when you're mapping, and when you're mapping and it casts Forbidden Right, it will enable you to get the +2 arrows from your tinctures. Thanks to that, you're getting +2 arrows with the tincture, you're getting +1 arrow from the flask effect, and you're getting +2 arrows from the dying sun for a whopping total of 5 arrows. This is basically doubling the number of arrows and projectiles in your build, and knowing Tornado Shot, it scales a lot, especially with the secondary projectiles. Another buff that we will be using is something called Adrenaline. We will be getting Adrenaline thanks to our Death Rush ring. Most Omniscience build will run double Omni rings. However, for mapping purposes, I think that Death Rush is better, and if you're able to satisfy the number of Omniscience needed, the Adrenaline buff is actually better than getting the raw 180 Omniscience. What is Adrenaline? It grants you 100% increased damage, 25% increased attack, cast, and movement speed, and an additional 10% physical damage reduction. There is no downsides of getting Adrenaline. On top of that, Death Rush will grant you life recovery on kill. You can regenerate pretty much all of your life in the matter of seconds without having to use Life Flask, because we will not be using Life Flask in our build. Now, the strongest buff in the game is going to be Berserk. Berserk grants you 20% more damage, 20% more attack speed, and 30% more movement speed. To understand how strong more is compared to increases, let's say a normal character has a 100% increased movement speed. If you get 30% movement speed, it will grant you 130. Same thing for more. If you have 30% more movement speed with a character that has 100% movement speed, you go to 130% movement speed. However, let's say the character had 300% movement speed. If you add a 30% increase, it will go to 330. However, if you do a 300% more for the 300% movement speed, it actually goes to 390 movement speed. Now, how do we run Berserk? Well, to run Berserk, we're going to use something called Rage. And Rage is pretty much going to be, the equivalent of mana for the buff. To gain Rage, we're going to be using a cast on crit, a Warlord's Mark setup. Warlord's Mark will curse enemies, and when you stun them, you gain 20 Rage. By using the Focal Point Ascendancy, it's going to become 35 Rage. It also gives you Endurance Charge when you slay an enemy, and Life and Mana Leech, which is good for recovery. For the Amulet, nothing new. We're going to be using Crystallized Omniscience. The percentage, the higher, the better. The useful annoyance are going to be Sovereignty, which is very good for mana efficiency and DPS. Especially, that will grant you the possibility to save yourself the 3 points for more mana reservation, because we're going to be trying to use 4 auras. We're going to be using Utmost Intellect if you don't have any mana problems. That will give you a big stat boost, which is very good for Omniscience. You could also use Multi-Shot for that +1 proj, which will save you 4 passive points to get to there. If you have none of those problems, you could go for the Frenetic or the Savagery, which will grant you an additional frenzy charges. Attribute quality is going to be the only useful quality. However, it's only going to give you +3 Omni, so it is very, very min-max type of area, so don't spend your currency on that except if you have currency for it. For the bow, our bow is going to need to be an elemental damage type, which means it's a triple elemental damage type. We're going to be searching for flat added elemental damage. Because we are relying heavily on critical strikes to inflict the ailments, to deal in damage, and to proc some rage, we're going to be using a crit based bow as the better option. Shooting additional arrows is the best stat you can get on any of your gear. However, it's going to make it very expensive. So by order, we're going to search for the highest elemental DPS possible, the highest amount of arrows, the highest amount of critical strike chance, and the highest amount of attack speed. At this point, please do not have any defensive modifiers on the bow. It is the gravest insult and mistake people make. You shouldn't have a single stat that has defense or that is related to defense on your bow. It's purely DPS purposes. For your quiver, it's pretty straightforward. You put your quiver in. If your DPS goes up, it's better. If you have a quiver that does not grant you additional arrow and you put another quiver that grants you an additional arrow, but your DPS goes down just a bit, it's better to go for that extra arrow, because in total, if you do the sum of all your arrows, your DPS is going to go higher. The best stats for your quiver are going to be flat damage, crit, and multi, projectile speed, and elemental damage. For the helmet, the best in slot is going to be the Black Sun Crest. It can give you up to 45% increase in Omniscience. Obviously, those are going to be the most expensive versions. However, you can have a huge boost in elemental resistance and huge boost in DPS thanks to this helmet. If you're running into very, very severe mana issues and you've tried everything and you cannot use your points or an unline to make it work, you could use a rare helmet with a reduced mana cost implicit, and you would search for life and attributes as other modifiers. However, I think that Black Sun Crest is worth the effort and make it work with your other gear. For the chest, it's either going to be a rare with the aura effect stats as implicit, so non-curse aura effect or anger effect. And for the explicits, you're going to be searching for suppression, avoidance, and life. For the unique section, I think that Harry's Ire, even at this budget, is still one of the best items. It gives you a ton of flat damage, a ton of evasion rating, a bit of dexterity, and 30% chance to suppress spell damage. Harry's Ire does not have a life modifier. However, there is a life mastery that can increase 15% of your life if you do not have a single life modifier on your body armor, which will work pretty well with Harry's Ire. The rings are going to be the main sources of omniscience. Without the rings, your build is probably never going to be able to work. It is what gives you the most amount of omniscience, and then all the multipliers, all the additions to omniscience will go from those rings. You can get 180, 190 omniscience quite easily, as this ring is the perfect example of an omniscience ring. 60 strength, 60 dex, 60 int, flat life, mana regen, which is a hybrid mod, so it's a 2-in-1 mod, and then non-channeling skills. The last mod is often going to be an Exalt Slam, so it's going to be pretty random. The best one being obviously an increase in elemental damage. Now, most players will run 2 omniscience rings, and then after a point, they're going to go for the Calandra and the Meritir ring. However, for the pure mapper, it is more beneficial to go for 1 omniscience ring and 1 death rush. The death rush will give us the adrenaline buff, and the adrenaline buff is actually stronger than getting the 180 omniscience. However, you will have the problem of not having the -7 twice, so the -14 to the total cost, as well as the mana regeneration. So I still think that you need to thread carefully when using Death Rush. Make sure that your build is able to handle all the content with 1 ring, and then go for the Death Rush. If not, don't ask yourself questions and go for 2 Omni Rings. The gloves are going to be the very cheap and unique item. Shadow and Dust can give you a lot of good bonuses, such as Critical Strike, Critical Multi, Leech, but it also gives you Rampage. Rampage is one of the best bonus in the game. It gives you it's kind of like a kill streak. You get a lot of bonuses once you reach a certain number of kills, as well as you have inherent bonus in attack damage and attack speed for every 20 Rampage stack. For the belts, I think the best one is actually going to be the Micro Distillery, because it gives you the 20 to 30% flask effect, and that will give you a lot of zoom. Paired with a Silver Flask and a Quicksilver Flask, the 30% increased effect can give you an additional 20-25% movement speed, and it works in symbiose with the Warden of the Maji tech for the +5 arrows in total. If not, you're going to go for the synthesized implicit belt, which have increase in either dex, strength, or int, the max being 18%. Those are going to be good for your omniscience. Or you can go for the Stygian Vise with the Abyssal Socket. For the explicits, you're going to be searching for the highest increase in attributes, flat life, and other useful mod. For example, Chaos Resistance is quite important. You also have Flask Charge Gain. I like that mod because you have better Flask Sustain, life regeneration. A lot of things can go on a belt, but the best ones being really life and those attributes. For the boots, the implicits, you're going to want the Avoid Ailment or Gain Physical as extra. And then you're going to want action speed or movement speed, action speed being better. For the explicits, you're going to search for movement speed. There's no reason of having boots that do not have movement speed. Just like don't. After that, you're going to want the Avoid Ailment, Spell Suppression, Life, and Attributes. So for the main links, for Tornado Shot, you're going to link it with Trinity, which is the best supporting gem for elemental damage. Inspiration for increased elemental damage, as well as you actually have a 34% mana cost reduction when you're using Inspiration, which is very useful. Elemental damage with attacks. Increased critical strike damage I think is more important and better than increased critical strike chance. For the last link, usually it's going to depend on your playstyle and the number of the socket colors that you have. I like to either run Mirage Archer. If you're not using any additional arrow, you could go for Greater Multiple Projectile. However, I don't suggest it unless you deal a lot of DPS, so a lot of damage. But if you just like having arrows on your screen, look, it's whatever you want. You can go for Crit Chance. You could go for any of the added damage, so added cold, added lightning, added fire, depending if you need them to be able to proc Trinity well, or any other gem that you like. For the primary Mana Forge setup, we're going to use Mana Forge Arrow that is linked with Lightning Arrow. So whenever we shoot, Lightning Arrow is going to shoot out from us. It's going to use a cast on crit with Warlord's Mark to be able to proc the stun and the rage regeneration. Life Tap will make it that we don't have to spend any mana to have Mana Forge, so it will trigger every 0.5 seconds, which is a cooldown. And then the last link, I like to run Return Projectile or Mirage Archer. If you want to completely discard the Rage setup, you can go for and you prefer single target DPS, you can go for the Mana Forge, Storm Rain, Blast Rain, Trinity, Gain or Leech for extra points, and Life Tap. For the secondary Mana Forge setup, there are two ways of doing so. It's going to be either with the Mana Forge, Frenzy, Power Charge on crit, and Culling Strike to get your Frenzy regeneration and your Power regeneration, as well as Culling Strike. Now, if you go for the Warden of the Magi, I then suggest going for the Mana Forge, Cast on crit, Forbidden Right, and Frenzy. For the auras, pretty simple. We're going to go for Precision for that accuracy rating and critical strike chance. Anger, which is the best elemental aura for flat damage. And then after that, it's going to be whether you wish to have Haste, Grace, or Determination. If you can, go for the Enlighten, which will grant you the ability to drop your reduced mana reservation in your tree. You will be able to use all of those auras and not run into mana issues. For the miscellaneous, so the last 4 links, I suggest going for Berserk. For Berserk, the best tip I have for you guys is to put it on left click and use the always attack while moving. This means when you're left clicking, you'll be running just like normal. And when Berserk can be used, it will automatically use it the moment you're walking. I then suggest to have any movement skill, whether it's a dash or a blink skill, Ice Golem for accuracy and crit, and then Immortal Call, which scales very well with Endurance Charge, which we will gain whenever we kill our enemies that are marked by Warlord's Mark, so it's a good synergy. Okay, so for the passive tree, it's going to be pretty much the same thing as the non-Omniscience version. However, we're going to just spec into more accuracy and attributes. So we're going to start here. We're going to go for the mana reservation and increased effect of auras. Go down here for more damage, life. This part here is going to be for movement speed and spell suppression, which is important for survivability. We're going to get the life node. Come down here for elemental node, which is increase in damage. Make sure to go on the right side for the non-damaging ailments, which is scorched, chilled, frozen, brittle, shocked, and sapped. Obviously, we will not be chilling, freezing, or shocking. However, it will increase the effect of brittle and sapped, as well as scorch. Down here, you can go for the crit here for the attributes, which is going to be very good for Omniscience, more life, and then long shot. Here, it's going to be for accuracy. It is very important that you have a 100% hit chance. Without the 100% hit chance, you have a lower chance of just hitting the enemy, and you have a lower chance of critting the enemies. The classic bow wheel with the increase in reduction of projectile speed is going to be very important as well. Sorry, I forgot to add that. If you are using Harry's Ire, use the 15% increased maximum life. If there is no life modifiers on equipped body armor, it is very useful. The spell suppression wheel to get ourselves capped to 100%. We're going for the multi-shot. Then we're going to go up. This is the classic Line Ice Fall, which is very, very strong. It counts for a 28% of your DPS. It is very strong. We are going for the Blood Drinker for more life, as well as life recovery on kill. And add that to the Death Rush. You're gaining up to 7% of life recovered per kill. You could go for the life and mana leech. However, once you have the level, you can go for what is called a Cluster Jewel. Cluster Jewel is an addition to your tree, and you can go for the Martial Prowess, Feed the Fury, and Fuel the Fight. Those are going to be the 3 best stats. Fuel the Fight is going to grant you Mana Leech, and Feed the Fury is going to grant you Life Leech, which is very good. And Martial Prowess will give you accuracy rating, global accuracy rating, damage, and attack speed. If you have more points, as this character is level 93, you only have to add just 2 cluster jewels here, which are going to be Eye to Eye and Repeater. The strongest one being the Eye to Eye. Eye to Eye is a better one than Repeater, even if you shoot from a further distance. So just mind for that. For the main ascendancy, we're going to go for the Tailwind, the Gathering Wind, which grants you a 8% action speed. You can have a 15% effect of Tailwind per Guild Force, which could go up to 10, which is 20% increased action speed. 20% increased action speed is you just do everything you do 10% quicker. You walk faster, you run faster, you shoot faster. Everything is just 20% quicker. You go for the Far Shot, which is going to give you a 60% more damage. Endless Munition for that 2 additional projectile, which scales extremely well with Tornado Shot. And then Focal Point for the increased effect of Mark, which means you have more rage when you stun an enemy. As well as the Mark will actually transfer to another enemy once the marked enemy dies, which is very good. If you're killing big packs and one of them survive, well, he'll have the mark, and once you kill him, you'll have even more rage. For the secondary ascendancy, let me go back to the level 93. Oh, it disappeared, but whatever. We're going to go for the Coated Blade, which grants you the ability to use tinctures. Tinctures will then be the one you're going to use, the one for the 2 projectile once you've got hit. So if you go for the Warden and you use Tincture, you're going to go for the Forbidden Right setup. The next one is going to be Nature's Concoction, which is going to be Flask Regeneration for the Dying Sun. as well as the 30% increased effect. So you can have that with micro distillery, which works very well. It's a nice synergy, and you have an additional extra arrow for a total of 5 arrows. The last point, I would go for Detect Evil. There's no real reason to go Detect Evil. We're not a sniper and we're not going to start aiming. However, the rest of the point is kind of like up to you. You could go for the Bar skin instead of running Grace if you want, or the Oath of the Magi, but however, we'll be using gems on every single setup. So the 4 last points, is going to be pretty much up to you. But the most important ones are going to be Coated Blade and Nature's Concoction. However, if you go for the Primalist, obviously you're going to go for the Might of the Bear, and then you're going to go for Charms. Charms being Spell Suppression, Flask Effect, Additional Projectile. Those are going to be the best mods. Basically anything that resembles a Deadeye is going to be the best, or anything that is in the Ascendancy. The Ranger Ascendancy is very powerful. However, there are other charms in other ascendancies that are useful. Example, plus 0.5 critical strike chance if you have maximum power charge. That's very good to get yourself crit cap. On that note, that ends the build guide. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the comments down below or in the Discord server. We have a community Discord that helps a lot of players every day. We have dedicated helpers. There's me. We have POBs. Pretty much every single question usually is already answered in the Discord, so if you want to check it out, you can always go in. It's free, no requirements needed. Hopefully you guys have a great mapping experience, great league thanks to this build, and have fun.